A future portrait of Brexit Britain, a broad brush picture from the Treasury of the damage to our economy after we leave the EU, and the grim detail from the Bank of England as house prices crash, inflation soars and the economy tumbles if we fail to reach a deal. Theresa May is out putting a positive spin on her Brexit deal again today, but there's no spinning the numbers coming from her own Treasury and the Bank of England. And while economic analyses are always full of caution and caveats, particularly now with all the uncertainties around Brexit, there's no denying one central fact, that leaving the EU under any scenario leaves Britain and all of us worse off. The Chancellor was preparing the ground before the figures with a round of interviews, a Remainer himself, but one this morning in damage limitation mode.
Yes, it's true. If we are only looking at the economic benefits, remaining in the EU is a slightly better economic outcome than the Prime Minister's deal. But the Prime Minister's deal gives an outcome remarkably close to the benefits of staying in the European Union, the economic benefits, while having all the political benefits of being independent.
There was no actual Treasury scenario that modelled the Prime Minister's deal, but even the one that looks most like it shows the UK economy would continue to grow, yes, but be nearly 4% smaller in 15 years than if we'd stayed in the EU. The country around 100 billion poorer annually, with everyone £1,000 worse off. No deal is the worst case, with the economy more than 9% smaller, hitting the North East, West Midlands and Northern Ireland the hardest, while the car and pharmaceutical industries would be more than 20% smaller than had we remained. David Davis, the former Brexit secretary, had his own charts. Predictably, they didn't tally with the Chancellor's.
Forecasts are not facts. These are polemical projections. It's notable they haven't published the assumptions, what trade assumptions have got in there, and they're no different from the Project Fear forecasts that predate them. So I'm afraid this is the Treasury view put into numbers. Never confuse precision with accuracy.
Theresa May focused on one point in the analysis, that the economy would still grow despite the Brexit drag.
This analysis does not show that we'll be poorer in the future than we are today. No, it doesn't. It shows we'll be better off with this deal.
It's not hard to be the best deal if it's the only deal. By definition, therefore, Mr. Speaker, by definition, it's also the worst deal.
In a plastic packaging factory in Coventry, a town which voted to leave the EU, the gloomy predictions left them both defiant and bemused.
Yeah, I still would have voted leave. I do think that, they should make it clearer what the deal actually is.
Seems like that you're the only country from whole EU who managed to step up, to speak up to the European Union, saying, hey, we don't like that. So from that side, good. But maybe you could have found a better solution.
Because she's saying we've got a deal, but I don't understand what the deal is.
Our job is not to hope for the best, but to prepare for the worst.
As the factory workers headed home, up popped the Governor of the Bank of England with a harsh warning about the reality of a disorderly Brexit. The economy crashes by 8% in a single year as house prices tumble by a third and inflation soars to 6.5%.
By the end of 2023, GDP is more than 10% lower in the disorderly scenario compared to that May 2016 trend. Despite this sharp contraction in GDP, something that's bigger than happened during the financial crisis, unemployment rises to 7.5%, less than during the financial crisis. And that reflects the supply-driven nature of the downturn.
The Bank of England governor there, and Siobhan joins me now. Siobhan, the economists have got it wrong many times before. Could Mark Carney and others have got it wrong today?
Well, funny you should say that. The minute he sat down not very long ago at the Bank of England there, Brexiteers like Jacob Rees-Mogg were simply dismissing these new predictions as more Project Fear. Certainly from the start of the day to the end of the day, Cathy, these numbers have looked very scary. Worth saying they're not forecasts, though. They are merely predictions based on different scenarios. The worst case, of course, being a no-deal scenario. But even in that case, the Governor of the Bank of England stresses that our banks, our financial system, could cope. Also worth noting, he points to one positive outcome, that if we do leave the EU with a very close relationship, not dissimilar to the one that we have now, that Brexit could actually add to UK GDP, to our growth by 2023. I'm not sure, though, Cathy, that there are many people who would agree with that prediction.
Well, this Treasury analysis had a few holes in, didn't it? Because it didn't, for example, run the slide rule specifically over Theresa May's deal.
Her own deal. Precisely. It also failed to predict what the backstop scenario might look like, which clearly they've been wrangling over for weeks. You might have expected to see an outcome modelling around that. But all the models, interestingly, did include the input of new trade deals, these much vaunted trade deals that are going to boost our growth in the years to come after we leave the EU. But when you look at the numbers, they actually add just a very minuscule amount, about 0.2% to our GDP in the next 15 years. So not very much at all.
Indeed. Siobhan, thanks very much. Well, a short time ago, I spoke to the Financial Secretary to the Treasury, Mel Stride. I began by asking him if he was proud to be part of a government that promises to make people poorer.
I'm proud to be part of a government that, despite all the naysayers saying we would never negotiate a deal with the European Union, has gone out and done just that. This is a deal that is going to be good for the economy going forward, but also it's going to deliver on the fundamentals of what the referendum in 2016 told us the British people wanted.
And it's a deal that will make people poorer. It's
a deal that will put an end to free movement. It's a deal that will stop us sending vast sums of money to the EU. It's a deal that will allow us to get out there and enter into trading arrangements with other countries around the world. It will protect the integrity of the United Kingdom. So this is a good...
And it will make the British people poorer.
Well, we've just released some figures today to baseline and compare the deal with other possibilities, such as free trade agreements, such as no deal at all. And the deal is by far the most economically positive of those alternatives. And
but
you say, well, hold on, Cathy.
Poorer.
Yes, because what you're saying is, well, you know, we could live in a world in which we hadn't decided to leave the European Union. Well, the decision was taken back in June 2016 that we should leave the EU, and that is what we're going to do.
Doesn't the government now have a responsibility to go back to the British people and say, OK, now that we've established that the deal we've put forward will make you poorer, we're going to give you a second chance to make sure that you're really sure you want to back this deal, and we're going to put it to a referendum?
No, I think that would be profoundly undemocratic to do that. We went out, and I say this as somebody who campaigned to remain, incidentally. We went out to the British people. We had the largest turnout at any electoral event in the history of our country. And the result was very clear, and that was that people voted to leave the EU. So that has to be our starting point.
Do you believe this analysis, or do you think it is Project Fear?
What I am satisfied of is that it has been properly looked at in an honest and in-depth way, without ministers, or certainly let alone the Treasury, interfering in any way at all. And this is the analysis that we have.
Just wondering what happened to the sunlit uplands. I mean, can you still see them?
Yeah, absolutely I can. Listen, if we get this deal agreed by Parliament, the whole mood music across the UK economy is going to change quite dramatically. Gone will be the uncertainty, gone will be the slowdown in investment decisions, gone will be those businesses out there that will be saying to themselves, do I hire somebody now or do I delay that decision? And we will move into a period of certainty, greater confidence. We've got that ability to have that deal that will deliver that. And what we don't want is to go and end up in a situation where we have a no deal, which would have a very detrimental effect.
And there are those who say that pigs will fly before you get Theresa May's deal through Parliament.
Well, they're probably the same people, Cathy, that said pigs will fly when we tried to get the Phase 1 agreement sorted out, the money with the EU, and we did that. And they're probably the same people that said pigs might fly when they said we'll never agree an implementation period with the EU, and we did that. And they're probably the same people that said pigs might fly if you think you're going to get a deal with the EU. Well, we've just done that.
Many pigs in the air. Mel Stride, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, after another bruising encounter at the dispatch box and another robust defence of her Brexit strategy, Mrs May flew to Glasgow as part of her efforts to sell her deal to voters, dropping in at a local factory to tell workers that the agreement would offer the chance of an unprecedented economic partnership with Europe. It was something of a flying visit, but our Scotland correspondent Kieran Jenkins has been getting some local reaction.
This is the Persuasion Tour, the Prime Minister taking her message, we're told, directly to the people. In this case, the people at a number 10 organised event in a leather factory near Glasgow. So how did Theresa May's sales pitch go down in Scotland?
It's all about chemistry as well as raw material.
Well, this chat is about leather.
Driving and automation, so one of the challenges we have.
She may well have spoken widely with workers here about her Brexit deal, but from the footage shared with us, we can't identify a conversation we could show you. And anyway, her line isn't changing.
People voted to leave, and I believe as politicians we should deliver that. We've negotiated a deal that delivers that Brexit and does it while protecting jobs, protecting livelihoods, protecting security and protecting our United Kingdom.
There was no trip to the coast for the Prime Minister, or indeed anywhere but here. Amid charges from her own party, she has sold out the fishing industry. She said this.
This is a deal that is right for Scotland and right for Scottish fishermen, because we'll take back control of our waters and ensure they have a bright future for Scottish fishing.
Theresa May wasn't knocking on doors today. She's visiting just a stone's throw away from you today. But we were. Do you think that she might just hop across from the factory there and knock on your door?
No.
What would Mr Galbraith say to the Prime Minister?
It's a dog's breakfast. We're making ourselves poorer and worse off. Why? The little Englander attitude, as far as I'm concerned.
It was indeed the day the government concluded its Brexit deal would do economic harm. Maybe a fatal blow in previous times, but not these.
I think she's doing a bloody good job, and if I would tell them to go and stuff it.
Mrs Bannerman doesn't believe the government's figures. The Chancellor has said today that the deal that she has is going to make us economically worse off.
Really?
Does that bother you?
It doesn't bother me because I don't believe it.
Hello. And neither does Mr Patterson. So even the Chancellor saying it, you don't believe it?
I don't believe him at all.
Why not?
I just don't believe that the politicians at the moment are telling us the truth.
Why would he not tell you the truth?
They're too busy stabbing each other on the back.
Well, Corey, get down.
Hello.
Sorry for that.
Ewan, though, would really have relished a couple of minutes with the PM.
I tell her it's been already proven that it's going to be detrimental to Scotland, so I don't know why she's pushing ahead with it. Despite all the parties that are elected to represent Scotland are going against it, so why does she continue to push forward that against Scotland as well?
Well, there she goes. Theresa May can now tick off Scotland from her UK tour. A single stop. She's been here less than 2 hours. What was the point? You may wonder. The real job of persuading was always going to take place elsewhere.
Well, I'm joined now from Edinburgh by Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. First Minister, the Bank of England's warnings that the pound will plunge, we'd be plunged into a recession if there's a no deal. The fact that you're refusing to back Theresa May's deal makes a no-deal scenario much more likely. Isn't that irresponsible?
Well, I don't accept that false choice. I mean, I've been warning about the catastrophe of a no-deal for the last 2.5 years. I was saying no deal would be catastrophic in the days when Theresa May was saying that no deal was better than a bad deal. She's now trying to say to people that we either have to accept her bad deal or face the prospect of a no deal. That's not true. There are other options. There's the option, the compromise option that the Scottish Government has proposed for the last couple of years of staying permanently inside the single market and customs union, or of course the option of another vote. And what I've said very clearly is that if the opposition in the House of Commons is going to vote down that deal, and it looks likely, and I think that's right, because it's a bad deal for Scotland, a bad deal for the UK, then we also have the obligation and the responsibility to come together around an alternative, and the SNP will certainly play its part in doing that.
OK, and your alternative, you've made clear, would be staying in the single market and a customs union, a kind of Norway plus deal, as you've put it. Can you give Theresa May a commitment now that the SNP would vote for a Norway plus deal if she put it on the table?
Well, we've said all along that we would support as a compromise, and let me stress that it's not our preferred position. Our preferred position is to remain in the EU, but we've said all along that if that compromise was on the table, we would support it. But instead of trying to reach compromise, Theresa May has insisted on imposing on herself red lines that have constrained her options. Of course, there is also the option of another vote. Theresa May is touring the country right now, not spending very long in any one place, as we saw in your film. But if she wants the electorate to judge this deal to be the people of the country, then perhaps she should give them a vote on the matter.
Well, it's
she
interesting.
seems to be very reluctant to do that.
Well, it's interesting that you're so keen on a second vote, because if you won a referendum on Scottish independence, you'd surely think it was outrageous if then your opponent said, let's put it back to the people for another vote.
Well, you know, the fact of the matter is circumstances have changed in the last 2 years. Whatever people voted for in 2016, they didn't vote for the chaos that we are now seeing and now experiencing. The government has failed to get its act together. It's failed to negotiate a deal that is in the interests of the country. And if Parliament can't agree that deal, then it is reasonable to look again at the principle of whether the UK should leave the EU or remain within the EU.
And if there
now,
was,
of course,
and wait a minute, if there was chaos after a Scottish independence referendum, a couple of years after that, would you be content to see that put back to the people?
Well, you see, there's a real contrast here that is very obvious for people between the Scottish independence referendum of 2014 and the Brexit vote of 2016. In 2016, we had the infamous lie on the side of a bus. In 2014, we had a 800-plus page document setting out the detail of Scottish independence, setting out very honestly and frankly some of the compromises and trade-offs that would require to be made, for example, a currency union that not everybody agreed with. So we were upfront and honest about some of the implications of Scottish independence. People knew what they were voting for.
Well, and Theresa May would say,
and that is very, very different from the Brexit vote in 2016.
Theresa May would say she's put out nearly as many pages on her deal, and yet you want to stay in a single market and a customs union, and you want to leave the common fisheries policy. I mean, aren't you, just like Boris Johnson, guilty of wanting to have your cake and eat it?
Well, of course, EFTA countries that are in the single market and not in the EU are not in the common fisheries policy, but in that deal that Theresa May struck at the weekend, I mean, clearly the way is being paved for another sellout of Scottish fishermen. But you talked about the hundreds of pages of the withdrawal deal, and there's lots in that, of course, to pore over. But the document that tells us what the future relationship between the UK and the EU is going to be amounts to 26 pages. There's a line in it that says there's a spectrum of options for the future. Voting for this in the House of Commons for MPs would be voting for a blindfold Brexit. It would be voting to leave the EU come the 29th of March next year without any idea at all of what the future relationship is going to be. Of course, what we see from the analysis published today is that all of these options, when the UK leaves the EU, if the UK leaves the EU, will make the country poorer. So Theresa May has failed. She's failed to bring back a deal that can unite people and that can attract support. And I think it is now time for her to look at the alternatives. And if she won't do it, the House of Commons should force her to.
OK. No deal is worst for the UK. The Bank of England and the Treasury made that clear today. But actually, you could argue it's best for the SNP, because the chaos that would come out of a no deal would enable you to justify a second independence referendum, wouldn't it?
Well, you see, this is where, you know, I have to say I'm very different from Boris Johnson, because I don't agree with that cynical approach to politics. I don't want to see the UK damage itself. I don't want to see that for its own sake. But equally, whatever the constitutional future of Scotland turns out to be, and I hope and expect that that will be as an independent country, it's always going to be in Scotland's interest for the rest of the UK to succeed, for the rest of the UK to have as close as possible a relationship with the European Union. So in all sincerity, I've put forward compromise options over the last couple of years with the best interest, not just of Scotland, but with the whole UK at heart. And what we found in those 2 years is that Theresa May has been unwilling to listen. She comes to Scotland today, but she has ignored completely Scotland's voice over these past couple of years, ignored the 62% vote to remain and ignored all attempts at compromise. And in doing so, actually, has immeasurably strengthened the case for Scotland to be an independent country.
OK, I'd love to ask you when, but we've run out of time. First Minister, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jackie.
Well, our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is in Westminster. Gary, how will today's economic forecasts affect Mrs May's chances of getting her deal through?
You heard Siobhan earlier in the programme talking about how the most prominent Brexiteers are saying they don't believe a word of this and it's not going to budge them. But other people who've come out against Theresa May's plan, other MPs, it's very difficult to see how they necessarily budge between now and the vote in just under 2 weeks' time. there's been an awful lot of them coming out and saying they're going to vote against it. This might be a function of social media. Statistically, it looks as though more people are more defiant early on these days, but it is really difficult for them to turn. What you can imagine it doing is turning public opinion. Theresa May seems to be doing quite well with public opinion right now. She's done quite well in the past, remember, and it's gone away from her. But right now, they seem to be on her side. How does that translate in under 2 weeks into a Commons vote? Quite difficult to see.
And on to Labour. I mean, today they're pretty angry about the government's refusal to publish the legal advice on this Brexit deal, aren't they?
That's right. Keir Starmer said in the House of Commons that he thought the government was in contempt of Parliament because it hadn't done what Parliament had voted for it to do and bring the full legal opinion into the public domain, publish it. Now, the Speaker, interestingly, turned around and sounded pretty interested in pursuing this. He said he'd make a statement on it quite soon. In theory, that could mean he triggers a vote in the House of Commons. Technically, that could then lead to a Privileges Committee inquiry by MPs, and then, potentially, technically, you could have a member of the government, maybe the Attorney General, maybe the effective Deputy Prime Minister, David Lidington, maybe even the Prime Minister, suspended from the House of Commons for contempt. Now, you'd scratch your head and think that's unthinkable, but right now an awful lot of unthinkable things seem to be happening.
And is there movement today on Labour's position on a second referendum or not?
Intriguing moment. John McDonnell turned round, Shadow Chancellor, and said in an interview that if after what he expects to be the defeat of Theresa May's plan in the Commons, there is not a general election, which Labour would obviously try very hard to get. If that didn't happen, well, then he said a second referendum was, quotes, inevitable. This led to a lot of iPhone activity and quite coarse language, I'm told, amongst some people in Labour High Command, wondering what exactly John McDonnell was up to. He issued his own statement, gave another interview saying, I wasn't saying anything out of the ordinary, I've been slightly misjudged or misquoted. Labour policy has not changed, but an awful lot of people are sniffing that John McDonnell is either trying to keep the right side of Labour membership, the right side of voters, both of those things, or maybe even trying to shift Labour Party policy. This is one to watch.